Good evening, all. On behalf of the School of English, Kumaragulu College of Liberal Arts and Science, I welcome you all to the expert conversation. The topic for the conversation today is ethnoliterature and environment in the Northeast Indian literary context. I take the privilege of introducing the expert of conversation today, Dr. John Charles Ryan. I was really surprised to know the multidisciplinary areas he has researched on. Dr. Ryan is an adjunct associate professor at Southern Cross University in Australia and adjunct senior research fellow at Notre Dame University, Australia, and honorary research fellow at the University of Western Australia. He is also a visiting scholar at University 17 Augustus 1947, Indonesia, and writer in residence at Oak Spring Garden Foundation in Virginia. Dr. Ryan has published widely in creative writing, literary studies, critical plant studies, and environmental humanities. His latest edited book is Australian Wetland Cultures, Swamps, and Environmental Crisis, which was published in 2019 by Lexington Books. His poetry collection, which is also focusing on environment, is in progress. You must be wondering if he is an environmentalist. The answer is yes, because he holds a master's degree in environmental philosophy and also in creative writing and doctorate in English language and literature. To be very precise, he is an environmental writer and a researcher, which is evident from his postdoctoral research that focus on potential of poetic practice to inspire understanding of natural world, in particular to redefine human-plant relationships. With this short introduction, I would request Dr. Ryan to take over the session. Over to you, Dr. Ryan.
Great, thank you very much for the warm introduction, and I will share my screen at the moment. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Radhika, and thank you very much to the college for inviting me to give this talk on a topic that fascinates me very much, ethnoliterature and the environment in the Northeast Indian literary context. I'd once again like to acknowledge Southern Cross University and the University of Notre Dame, both in Australia, as well as Untog Surabaya, the university in Indonesia that is hosting me for 4 or 5 months this year. So this is the overview of what I'd like to present today. I'll begin with the question of what is ethnoliterature. It's a broad term, and it includes a number of sub-terms: indigenous literature, tribal literature, folk literature, ethnic minority literature, multi-ethnic literature, and finally ethnographic literature. And I'll suggest that within this broad term of ethnoliterature, we can think about these different terms encompassed within that term. The second part is the question of what is environmental literature. I'll look at the idea of the environmental text, eco-criticism, which is perhaps a field you've heard of, a field that is becoming more popular as many literary scholars address the environmental crisis that's happening across the world. And in particular, I'll look at the idea of comparative eco-criticism, that is looking at environmental texts from different parts of the world, different regions, and coming up with comparative analyses. I'll look at the very flourishing area of eco-poetics, which is environmental poetry, And then two relatively new areas in the study of environment and literature. The first is animals in literature, or zoo criticism, and the second is plants in literature, or what is known as phytocriticism. I'll then turn to three examples of ethnoliterature, the from Indonesian poetry and the work of Khairani Barokka, the second from Myanmar and the work of Mia Kabyar, and the third from Northeast India and the work of Mamang. So this is very much a presentation about the literary, geographical, and ecological connections between Southeast Asia and Northeast India, beginning with Arunachal Pradesh in Northeast India, and the writer Mamang from that part of India, and the Chin Hills bioregion of Northwest Myanmar, and then where I find myself now in Indonesia, specifically some writing that's been done on the island of Borneo, or Kalimantan, which is the southern Indonesian part of the island of Borneo. So I encourage you to think about the connections between regions and how that impacts literary production and the kinds of messages that writers want to convey, especially those writers from indigenous communities. So the question of what is ethnoliterature? We'll begin with the idea of indigenous literature. Now, an indigenous literary work is any literary work, could be fiction or nonfiction or poetry or drama, that's authored by an indigenous person, or in the case of anthologies and multi-authored works, indigenous people, right? So the question in indigenous literature is who are indigenous people? These include texts written by the indigenous people of North, Central, and South America, as well as Oceania, which includes New Zealand, Australia, and the South Pacific, Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. So we can think of the indigenous literature of those parts of the world. In fact, every part of the world has indigenous people. So indigenous literature is omnipresent. It's everywhere across the world. Indigenous literature, though it's diverse, can be thought of in terms of its common themes. Those include the transformation of traditional relationships to land, culture, and community. Of course, indigenous people around the world have gone through great changes, especially since colonial histories in certain countries, right? So indigenous literature shares the commonality of examining those changes in land, culture, and community. Indigenous literature, secondly, often includes a basis in oral narratives and myths, right? So many indigenous cultures have a long and vibrant history of oral traditions. Those oral traditions, those oral narratives, factor into indigenous literature in the contemporary sense of the word. So that brings me to the idea of colonialism. And indigenous literature often confronts ideas of colonialism, issues of colonialism, but also neo-colonialism. That refers to the ongoing effects of colonialism, even after the colonial occupier has left, right? So that's referred to as neo-colonialism. And globalization, right? The trend towards an increasingly globalized and, in some cases, homogenized culture. So in this sense, indigenous is defined as those people living in a place before colonial occupation, okay? And in certain parts of the world, in Australia, for example, indigenous is fairly clear-cut, right? So the indigenous people of Australia lived on the continent before the arrival of French and British settlers, okay? And finally, contemporary indigenous literature is often written for both non-indigenous and indigenous audiences. So that means there's an element of translation that's at play. The indigenous author is attempting to translate ideas from his or her indigenous tradition to audiences who may not be familiar with those traditions. And increasingly, it's the case of indigenous authors writing for international audiences. We see that especially in Australian literature. Now, Australian literature is an interesting case of Indigenous literature because you could argue that it has a more than 60,000 year tradition. Australian Aboriginal people have have inhabited the continent of Australia for at least 60,000 years. That's been shown by archaeologists. Arguably, that number is much higher. So contemporary Aboriginal Australian literature draws from that vast tradition of oral narratives, of song narratives, works of culture that were sung as a way to transmit them from person to person and generation to generation. And this kind of literature, as many other kinds of Indigenous literature, reverberates with allusions to the natural world. These allusions or these references to nature are often embedded in what are known in Australia as the dreaming or creation stories. These are the mythologies or the creation stories that give an explanation for how certain places on the continent came to be. Now, the Australian tradition of Indigenous literature in the contemporary sense began with nonfiction as recently as 1930 in David Unapan's Myths and Legends of the Australian Aboriginals. In 1964, Udru Nunokal published We Are Going, which is the first published poetry collection by an Aboriginal Australian poet. Now, there's also a work called Wildcat Falling from 1965. That's by an author named Madruru. It's a work of fiction that's important in the consideration of Indigenous Australian fiction. However, it should be borne in mind that it's a contested work. Madruru's identity has been contested. Nonetheless, it's still an important work in the history of Australian Aboriginal literature. And finally, in 1987, a monumental work by Sally Morgan, perhaps one of the most influential Aboriginal memoirs, called My Place. Now, tribal literature is comparably a work of literary fiction, nonfiction, poetry, or drama authored by a person with tribal ancestry. Now, this term is, as I understand it, used more commonly in South Asia and Africa, but it's used less commonly nowadays in North America and elsewhere, where the terminology has changed. But tribal literature commonly addresses the search for identity, threats to tribal solidarity or existence, and also the ways in which tribal cultures and communities resist forms of exploitation in the neo-colonial sense that I just mentioned earlier, the ongoing impacts of colonization. Recurring themes include traditional relations to natural, cultural, social, and spiritual worlds. Now, in India, and I'm sure there are experts in the audience who can speak more authoritatively on this topic than I can, we can speak of Dalit and Adivasi literature, written by authors with tribal heritage. The author, the poet I will mention later in the presentation is Mamang, a phenomenal poet, but also a writer of nonfiction and journalism and all sorts of other genres. In India, as I understand it, the idea of tribal heritage or identity encompasses the scheduled tribes of India, of which there are many, as we will discuss, in the northeast region of India, which is adjacent to Southeast Asia, and specifically Myanmar. Since the 1990s, Dalit writing, identified by an author's social background, has become a very important genre within Hindi literature. So Indigenous literature and tribal literature, really it's an exploration of categories. However, we're talking about Indigenous communities and authors who write about common themes. Now, the other term you will come across is folk literature. This is a broader kind of category. This comprises myths and legends, epics and fables, songs and ballads, proverbs, riddles, and charms, all sorts of other folk narratives. These are typically passed from generation to generation by word of mouth, right? So folk literature is sometimes referred to as oral or traditional literature. However, it's not necessarily interchangeable with Indigenous literature. So a work of folk literature may also be a work of Indigenous literature, but not necessarily, right? Whereas many works of Indigenous literature have folk elements, so they will narrativize traditional myths and customs and songs and proverbs from that cultural tradition. Orality, once again, is a very important component of folk literature, the song-like qualities of a work of folk literature. Mnemonic techniques such as repetition that enable people to remember and to then pass on those works of folk literature as predominantly based in oral narratives. So those are some common features. Often folk literature communicates what's known as traditional ecological knowledge. The abbreviation that you'll see for that is TEK, T-E-K. Now, traditional ecological knowledge is slightly different to what we can think of as sanctioned scientific knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge comes from the cultural tradition. Scientific knowledge comes from scientific practice and tradition. TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, often represents ideas of ancestral human-nature interactions. In some ways, traditional ecological knowledge reflects or sometimes intersects with sanctioned scientific knowledge. So there's sometimes a tension there. If you think of a tree, right, for example, maybe a traditional ecological knowledge of the tree would say that there's a deity that occupies or inhabits that tree, and that certain behaviors to protect that tree are efforts to entreat or to appease a deity that occupies that tree, right? So that might be an idea of a traditional ecological knowledge. Now, the sanctioned scientific paradigm would not necessarily recognize that ecological knowledge. The scientific paradigm might talk about the chemicals that circulate within that tree. It might talk about other scientifically verifiable dimensions of the tree. Now, typically folk authors are not, the original folk authors are not identifiable or known. That's common with many works of folk literature because the narratives have been passed on from generation to generation and they've undergone an evolution over that time. So the original author might not be known, and it could be the case that there was no original author, that the works evolved out of the community. So it might be an original case of multi-authorship, but that often isn't able to be traced. So we can think of these folk narratives that are reinterpreted by contemporary authors. So a key work in this area is Joseph Campbell's work. He wrote a very influential book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, in which he talks about the commonalities of myths across the world, what he called the archetypal mythologies, and also how folklore functions on a sociological, a cultural level, also a psychological level. Now, the other term you might come across is ethnic minority literature. And as I understand it, these are works written by members of ethnic minority groups in contrast to a dominant social group. And this term reflects a common history, language, customs, area of inhabitation, so environment, and livelihood. It's used very much in the United States tradition of literature to speak about Hispanic, Latino, African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native American, and Indigenous literature. So the ethnic minority literature category encompasses these diverse ethnic literatures in the United States. Now in China, this term refers to 55 recognized national minority groups, each of which has its own literary tradition. So as I've understood it, ethnic minority literature, the term itself, is used commonly in the US and China, and multi-ethnic literature is another term you might come across, and this is used also in the American context to refer to the diversity of ethnic minority literature. So to study multi-ethnic literature, One might look at Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eyes, Anaya's Bless Me Ultima, Silko, the Native American writer, and her semi-autobiographical novel Ceremony from 1977, one of the very important early works of Native American fiction, semi-fictionalized account of her life. Now, ethnographic literature is the last term I want to introduce to you. And this is a very interesting one. It brings together literary studies on the one hand and ethnographic or cultural studies on the other. There's a term that's circulating more in literary studies, and that's called ethnographic fiction. This evokes cultural experience and sense of place using literary techniques to craft conventional ethnographic materials. So if you're an ethnographer, which a tradition of scholarship that comes out of the social sciences, and in particular anthropology, the kind of data collection you do is interviews, participant observation, surveys, you take notes when you're in the field, you take photographs, you also, more nowadays, also you take video documentation. What a work of ethnographic fiction does is interpret all of that ethnographic data and create a compelling story. So that story might be based on fact, but it could be the case where it's semi or wholly fictionalized, and that's what ethnographic fiction does. Now, ethnographic nonfiction is a kind of literary nonfiction that has a strong tradition in the discipline of anthropology. And so this is the same process of collecting ethnographic materials. It could be the interviews and surveys and photographs from the field, but then you create a work of nonfiction, narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction. In the American literary tradition, a book called Island Within from Richard Nelson is a very prominent work in ethnographic nonfiction. Now, Nelson was an anthropologist. He studied the indigenous people of Alaska, and he wrote a nonfiction account of his work with the indigenous people. Now, it's also, Nelson's book is also a bit like a memoir of his interaction with indigenous Alaskan people over that time. Ethnographic poetry, similar idea to fiction and nonfiction, but the poets create verse that's influenced by ethnographic material. It could be the case where a poet conducts an interview with someone and then turns that interview transcript into a poem. In Australia, a very prominent example of ethnographic poetry is called Story About Feeling by the Aboriginal poet Bill Niji. Okay, a story about feeling. Ethnopoetics is related to ethnographic poetry. It's another term that's circulating. It's also known as cultural poetics, and it can be defined as non-Western, non-canonical. So apart from the canon of poetry that's taught. By canon, I mean, say, in the English literary tradition, we might think of Wordsworth. In Australia, we might think of Les Murray, Judith Wright. These are canonical poets, canonical poetries. So by non-canonical, these are poets and poetries that are not recognized by that canon, or at least haven't yet been recognized. And they come from the poems, and the poets are linked to ancient and autochthonous cultures. Now, an autochthonous culture is one that has a close relationship to the earth, either through forms of agriculture, hunting and gathering, or through the kinds of cosmologies and stories that relate to the earth. A key work in this area is Rothenberg's Technicians of the Sacred, that was published in 1968. You can see how it encompasses a number of ethnopoetic traditions, and it was the first to give a kind of prominence to ethnopoetics and ethnopoets. Now, what I want us to do is combine that knowledge of ethnoliterature in its various permutations with the idea of environmental literature. Environmental literature is a rapidly growing area, and that has to do with the fact that the environmental situation in the world is getting worse all the time. And so there's a great interest now in literary studies in the environment and environmental issues. The term environmental text refers to any text. It could be a novel, a film, a poem, an advertisement even, if we think more in media and cultural studies. But any text, any cultural text or literary text that represents the environment, ecological issues, or human nature relations. Okay. Now, this term has about a 25-year history. It was defined by the American literary scholar Lawrence Buell in the mid-90s in his seminal book called The Environmental Imagination. And he defined it as this: the non-human environment is present in the text, not merely as a framing device, but as a presence. And this is what we mean when we talk about giving agency to nature. That nature in the text is given a role almost as a human character would be given. That the background in a story, the background may be a mountain, let's say, but in fact, that mountain is having a great impact on the story and should have an impact on our interpretation of the story. That's what eco-criticism argues. Eco-criticism is the literary and historical analysis of environmental texts, right? So authors write environmental texts. Eco-critics analyze those environmental texts. This also has about a 25-year history, eco-criticism, although arguably it traces back to the 70s and before. But in the American tradition, it can be dated to around the mid-90s, 1996, and the publication of the Eco-Criticism Reader. Now, Glotfelty, who's an eco-critic, she defined eco-criticism as the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, demonstrating or adopting an earth-centered approach to literary studies. Now, since that 1996 definition, eco-criticism has diversified into a lot of different specializations. There's ecofeminist criticism. There is also affective eco-criticism, which looks at the emotional relationships that human characters have to the land. And also a really interesting area called empirical eco-criticism, which attempts to apply methods of social science and also quantitative methods, in fact, statistical methods, to understanding the impact of literary texts on people's environmental consciousness. Ecopoetics is another growing area. And ecopoetics, it can first of all be thought of as a genre of poetry that expresses pressing ecological values and concerns, that critiques environmental degradation and the politics behind environmental degradation, and that ultimately upholds the kind of ethics of the natural world. All right, so ecopoetics, and that has about, the term itself has been in circulation for at least 20 years, but ecopoetics as a genre has been going on for a long time. Arguably, Wordsworth was writing ecopoetics and poets before him. Now, ecopoetics in its contemporary manifestation is often linked to activism and advocacy. So the message of the poem is often about protecting the environment and advocacy and activism, but eco-poets themselves are often activists and advocates for the environment. And we see that in the case especially of Mamang, and in fact, all the three poets we'll look at in a moment. Now, you probably have heard of the term nature poetry, but that's not the same as ecopoetics or ecopoetry. Nature poetry has a very specific historical derivation. It comes from the tradition of British Romanticism, and specifically the pastoral tradition, which was very much about pastoral landscapes of working landscapes with shepherds and sheep and shepherdesses and this sort of thing, a very harmonious view of the pastoral landscape, a kind of celebration of the pastoral or the agricultural environment. Now, landscape poetry is another term, but that's a little different as well. That has to do with the aesthetic appreciation of the visual features of an environment. Now, an environment might be picturesque, right? You might have a beautiful view over a landscape. You can describe that as picturesque. Landscape poetry would celebrate that picturesque quality of the landscape. And certainly a poet like Wordsworth, other poets, especially of his era, the Romantic poets, were also landscape poets. They write about that visual impact of the land. Now, ecopoetics, we can call it a genre of poetry, but it's also a mode of literary analysis. So we can develop an ecopoetic reading of a poem that hasn't necessarily been thought of as an environmental poem before. And that's where ecopoetics can lead to innovation, right? To the interpretation of poets, poetries, and traditions of poetry from an environmental perspective. So that's what I mean by ecopoetics, is both a genre, but also a mode of analysis. And to add, more to that consideration, the word ecopoetics, as I've detected, has started to be used to characterize environmental activism projects in general that focus on sustainability and human nature balance. So we can talk about an ecopoetic community initiative. Let's say it's a community initiative surrounding organic farming and preserving the habitat on an organic farm. That could be described as an ecopoetic project. And the last two areas I'll introduce, the first is animals in literature. That examines animal texts, which represent animal life and human-animal interactions or relations. The study of animal text is known as zoo criticism, and that's the reading of text through an animal-focused lens. It could once again be the case of a zoo critic looking at an established animal text, an established text that deals with animals. George Orwell, some of his writings, right, on, or some other writers who have written explicitly about animals. However, we can use a zoo critical lens to look at texts of various kinds, so that if the novel is about a man's interaction with a horse or something like that, in the riding the horse and developing a relationship with the horse based on working the land, this novel could be read from a zoo critical perspective. Now, zoo criticism emerged out of animal ethics debates that began in earnest in the 1960s. And since then, a very interdisciplinary field called human-animal studies has grown. Now, human-animal studies is a field that's in fact taught at veterinarian colleges. And so it's a very interdisciplinary field that looks at human-animal relations. So this is where zoo criticism is emerging out of. Now, a very new, very recent, and very dynamic and interesting field, and one that I've been working in as well, is called phytocriticism, or plants in literature. A plant text comparable to an animal text would address, rather than animals, would address plants in detail, right? Trees or gardens or wild plant communities or endangered plants or whatever it may be. Phytocriticism is the analysis of a literary text from a plant-focused perspective. So you might look at the representation of a forest in a particular novel. That would be a phytocritical analysis. And what that analysis would say, typically, is that the forest is more than a setting, more than a backdrop to human affairs, that the forest exerts its own agency within that scene and within that literary work. And comparable again to animal studies, the animal and plant studies have a kind of parallel development, though animal studies has a longer history, and zoo criticism has a slightly longer history. But plants in literature and the phytocritical debate has emerged out of plant ethics debates. These have been going on for at least 10 years. These debates are looking at the treatment of plants in various social and community settings, and how to best approach plants ethically to ensure that plants survive. And this has given rise to what's known as human plant studies, a very interdisciplinary field, drawing from literary studies, but also from cultural studies in a number of areas, philosophical studies, to look at very closely the human relationships to plants that are often taken for granted, right? We eat plants all the time. We have to So a human plant studies scholar would examine that relationship closely, would dissect and investigate that relationship. Great, so we covered those two broad questions. Let's see how these two areas converge in three examples, the first being from Indonesia. So I want to give you an example of an Indonesian environmental ethnopoetics. Indonesia, of course, as many other countries in the world, the same could be said of, faces a number of urgent ecological issues, right? This is where I find myself at the moment, in fact, in East Java, Indonesia. Broad-scale deforestation for palm oil, biodiversity decline, air and water pollution. All of these issues are commensurate with the fast growth of the human population and the growth of techno-industrialization, right? So Indonesia's economy has grown to be very strong, but at the same time, it's come with a cost. And one of those costs is environmental. So mercury contamination, carbon monoxide, pesticide poisoning. These sorts of issues are very important on Indonesia's 17,500 islands, but especially on Java, Sumatra, and Kalimantan, which are the most industry-intensive islands of Indonesia. Now, as I understand it, native Indonesians are also known as pribumi, literally meaning first on the soil. These are Indonesians whose ancestral roots lie mainly in the archipelago, rather than, or in distinction to Indonesians of Chinese descent or Malaysian descent, or other Pacific forms of Pacific descent. Now, the island of Borneo featured here is home to more than 400 cultural groups, including the Iban, the Kayan, the Kandayan, the Kenya, Tunjun, many, many others. And this island of Borneo, of course, includes Brunei, Malaysian Borneo, and then Kalimantan, the Indonesian side, the Indonesian end of Borneo. Now, the indigenous people of Indonesian Borneo, of Kalimantan, are known as collectively as the Dayaks. The Dayaks, and these include, this term includes about 200 different indigenous groups. So this background is important for understanding the work of Khairani Barokka, who's an Indonesian poet. She's also a performer, a producer, and an artist. Her latest collection is called Rope, very much an environmental text that deals with human impacts on the biosphere. She's also a performance artist, a hearing impaired artist who's performed accessible shows, such as this one here, Even Merry or Having Coffee. Now, the poem I'll just talk about briefly here is called Indigenous Species, and that was first performed in 2013 at the Melbourne's Emerging Writers Festival. It's a long poem. The published version includes traditional verse, but also visual art coming from the Dayak motifs, and also Braille. So it's a really interesting example of an environmental text. And I want to describe it as an example of a Indonesian environmental ethnopoetics. Remember the convergence of ethnoliterature and environmental literature. Now, Barokka's poem is a kind of an appeal to turn the tide of environmental degradation in Indonesia, but it has a lot of relevance to locations outside of Indonesia. So the message of preserving vanishing animals and plants is very strong, and also the indigenous communities that rely on them. It's a very strong message in the work. In the poem, an indigenous girl is smuggled on a boat up an Indonesian river, presumably in Borneo, in Kalimantan, through a rainforest that's scarred by pollution, a habitat loss, and the local complications of global consumerism, right? So the demands for certain products like palm oil, which come from global sources, those demands are global. They have these very acute local impacts. And this poem is set in Kalimantan, and it's narrated from the perspective of the abducted girl. As this is a poem that centralizes a variety of issues, the forced relocation of indigenous communities, the clearance of forests, the incidences of human disease caused by smog, the loss of charismatic animals like orangutans, these all factor into this poem. And it's kind of Barokka's response to the widespread media coverage of some of these issues affecting Indonesian communities, indigenous Indonesian communities. Interestingly, this poem incorporates also traditional motifs from the Dayak culture, visual motifs, but also in that sense of folklore, it includes Indonesian rhymes and sayings, such as nature becomes teacher in Bahasa Indonesian. So it's an example, once again, of an ethno-literature work incorporating folklore and folk ideas. So indigenous species calls urgencies to these issues, and it underscores the precarity of biodiversity, but it also calls for a kind of environmental ethics, as we see in this passage here. When you wrap chloroform in my mouth, we are drifting past open sores of forest, pestilent red wounds in the trunks, exposing great-great-grandmotherly rings, the circumferences it takes for rainforest to sprout its many legs of mystery, the soup of complex resilience. So in her captivity, the young narrator reflects on these traditional relationships with the rainforest that are now being threatened. And she reflects on these as she and her captors move through this impacted landscape. These traditions, of course, have to deal with food, with clothing, with shelter, with medicine, and also with identity, the ways in which indigenous communities have a kind of identity achieved and actualized through the landscape. And there's a sense of loss, but also there's a sense that these traditions can be recuperated. So there's a hopeful sense as well. So she says, I would tell you this, but you are already knotting one of my ankles tight to the other. We once let the jungle whittle our lives down to habit, forest sculpting foraging patterns, spice configurations in soup, longhouse architectural trends, how women live with bleeding, what we can't name our children, how we groom the pelts on our bodies, right? So how the landscape determined or shaped certain aspects of the culture. Now, these effects are cultural, the effects of forest loss and pollution are cultural as well as ecological, as well as bodily. So these effects register on a bodily level, and she describes that here. And I don't want to grow old. As you paddle down river with the mercury beating down your synapses, eating at your unborn childlings, while I close my eyes and look away and pretend girls of my age don't live here and won't. So she then goes on to talk about, quote, collapsing entire cosmologies, indigenous cosmologies, I would say, into pulp and paper, and the conversion of those eons, quote, eons of intricacies and strength from the forest to molecular form on a woman's lipstick bottle in Iowa, right? So this global demand for palm oil that ends up in makeups like lipstick have these very traumatic local effects. So that's an example of Indonesian ethnopoetics. Let's look at an example of Myanmar environmental ethnopoetics. And India and Myanmar, of course, share a 1,600-kilometer border. 4 Northeast Indian states share the border with Myanmar, namely Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Manipur. The India-Myanmar border barrier is a project that was begun in 2003 to seal this border in an effort to curtail cross-border crime. Now that has a lot of rational justification to it from a crime perspective, but in fact, that sort of border disrupts those indigenous cultural traditions that cross between countries that don't adhere to particular political demarcations. Now, the Chin Hills is a range of mountains in the Chin state, northwest Myanmar. Chin State also extends northward up to Manipur State. The Chin people have and here we go, the Chin Hills, also very close to Bangladesh. The Chin people have a traditional knowledge of the environment that does not adhere to these political demarcations. So this knowledge extends across that political boundary. The traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge of Chin people is a common subject of their poetry, their relationships to the land. Now, historically, this area, the Chin Mountains, has been populated by Chin people who are Tibeto-Burman ethnic group, indigenous to the region. Chins have also been subject of extensive political persecution, and that's caused their movement across the border in particular into Mizoram. And in 2011, there were estimated 100,000 Chins living in the Indian state of Mizoram. Now, Mia Kabyar is a poet from the Chin tradition, born very close to the Bangladeshi border, regarded as the leading Chin poet. He is a politician as well. He helped to found the Chin Progressive Party in 2010 and continues actively in that political capacity. Now, his poetry addresses Chin ethnicity, heritage, place, environment, and social justice. He's writing from the perspective of an ethnic minority group member. And what that means in Myanmar is resisting what's known as Barmanization, the conversion of Myanmar's ethnic minority groups by the majority Burmans, or Bamar, right? So that in America, that could be called analogously the Americanization of Native American, indigenous North American groups, right? So Barmanization, that's an element of resistance that occurs in his poetry, a resistance to Barmanization. And I recommend this anthology of Mia Kabyar's work, along with several other writers from ethnic minority traditions in Myanmar. Now, here's a poem by Kabyar. It comes from, in fact, an excerpt from a poem. It comes from Panorama of Hornbills. Now, a hornbill is a very important animal, both for Myanmar ethnic minority groups and for Northeast Indian groups as well. A hornbill is a long-lived bird, remarkable size and coloration, one that has been important for traditional ceremonies both in Myanmar and Northeast India, but a bird that's also increasingly endangered by human activities, both indigenous and non-indigenous activities. So Kabyar writes of shifting cultivation, soil erosion, deforestation exacerbated, streams dried out, biodiversity drying out, rare orchids rare, poverty at 73%, consciousness fading. So there's a distinctive Chin outlook in this poem that recognizes the natural world, but also the impacts on the natural world as the poet looks out at this panorama, at this picturesque view, which should ordinarily be beautiful. He sees soil erosion and deforestation, biodiversity decline, poverty, human poverty at 3/4, consciousness fading, and we're left with that kind of ambivalent or ambiguous notion of consciousness fading. This could be environmental consciousness. This could be human consciousness in general. This could be tribal and ethnic minority consciousness. So that's a very important final phrase in that excerpt. Now, to conclude, let's look at Northeast Indian environmental ethnopoetics. The poetry of Northeast India has been the subject of much study and anthologization. This is a very interesting study from 2007, Ecology, Myth and Mystery, Contemporary Poetry in English from Northeast India, and also a major Oxford anthology edited by Misra called Oxford Anthology of Writings from Northeast India, including poetry and essays. Now, Northeast Indian poetry often reflects what's known as a biocentric or life-focused outlook, and an ecocentric or environment-focused worldview. It depicts organisms in a kind of mutual reactive interrelation with human environment. So there's a tradition of connectivity between the human and the non-human in Northeast Indian poetry. Now, the poetry of Mamang from Arunachal Pradesh, and another poet, very prominent poet from Northeast India, Temsulayo from Nagaland, also exhibits eco-feminist themes. Now, eco-feminist looks at the relationship of women to the environment, but also the ways in which both women and environment have been marginalized and oppressed by masculinist forces. The ethnographic poetry of Northeast India expresses often feelings of loss and mourning over the changes to the culture and landscape of the region. But there's themes various, just as in Myanmar poetry, the themes vary from folk knowledge to ecology to contemporary social and political issues. Okay. So Mamang is a poet I admire greatly. And in the audience now, I'm sure there are people who know more about her poetry than I do, but I'd like to just give you a brief overview of her. She's not only a poet, but a novelist, a folklorist, a journalist, a broadcaster, and a conservationist based in Arunachal Pradesh, and one belonging to the Adi people. Now, the Adi, as I understand it, are among the most populous indigenous cultural groups of Arunachal Pradesh. She won some major award in 2017 for her novel, The Black Hill. And she also has that direct experience of biodiversity conservation. And you may remember in my discussion of ecopoetics, I said that there's an activism and advocacy element. So Mamang is a good example of an ecopoetic writer, as I understand her work, and also a journalist working in environmental journalism for some major news outlets. Now, she's worked in nonfiction, writing of food, also in fiction folklore, the legends of Pansam, and also in poetry. So quite a well-rounded writer. And the poem that I'll conclude on is called The Voice of the Mountain, from 2005. And in this poem, nature speaks to people through a variety of signs, and the poem expresses her environmental ethic. But I'd like you to think of why this poem is an example of environmental or environmental ethnoliterature, how it brings concerns of culture and ethnicity and ethnography to bear on the environment. So think about that. I'm just going to read the poem and then conclude the presentation. Mamang, the voice of the mountain. From where I sit on the high platform, I can see the ferry lights crisscrossing the big river. I know the towns, the estuary mouth. There, beyond the last bank, where the color drains from heaven, I can outline the chapters of the world. The other day, a young man arrived from the village. Because he could not speak, he brought a gift of fish from the land of rivers. It seems such acts are repeated. We live in territories forever ancient and new, and as we speak in changing languages, I also leave my spear leaning by the tree and tried to make a sign. I am an old man sipping the breeze that is forever young. In my life, I have lived many lives. My voice is sea waves and mountain peaks in the transfer of symbols. I am the chance syllable that orders the world, instructed with history and miracles. I am the desert and the rain, the wild bird that sits in the west, the past that recreates itself, and particles of life that clutch and cling for thousands of years. I know these things as rocks know, burning in the sun's embrace, about clouds and sudden rain, as I know a cloud is a cloud. A cloud is this uncertain pulse that sits over my heart. In the end, the universe yields nothing except a dream of permanence. Peace is a falsity. A moment of rest comes after long combat. From the east, the warrior returns with the blood of peonies. I am the child who died at the edge of the world, the distance between end and hope, the star diagram that fell from the sky, the summer that makes men weep. I am the woman lost in translation, who survives with happiness to carry on. I am the breath that opens the mouth of the canyon, The sunlight on the tips of trees, there, where the narrow gorge hastens the wind, I am the place where memory escapes, the myth of time. I am the sleep in the mind of the mountain. So consider this question: why is Mamang Dai's poem an example of environmental ethnopoetics? And perhaps we can chat about that in the questions. But I'll just briefly conclude. This connection between ethnoliterature and environments is a powerful one. Environment encompasses nature and land and non-human life and human-nature relations. And it's an intrinsic element of works of ethnoliterature as we've defined it variously. The literary expression of Dai, Kabyar, and Barokka is interlaced with environmental values, meanings, and messages. And that's where the work of the critic comes in as significant, to identify those environmental values. Now, the approach I've taken here, in which I recommend to you, is an environmental, a comparative, eco-critical environmental approach. And that allows a kind of cross-cultural understanding of the environmental concerns shared between writers and regions in an era of incredible biocultural loss, which is increasingly being called the Anthropocene. We live in a new era, one that's replaced the Holocene, and that's being called the Anthropocene. So we live in a very important time for the discussion of ethnoliterature and the environment. So thank you very, very much for your attention, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have on this topic, and I will now unshare my screen, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you, Dr. John. It was a very wonderful presentation, and we had got a wonderful insight about eco-criticism, eco-feminism, ethnoliterature, and zoo-criticism, phytocriticism. So it was really a new topic and a very interesting one. Thanks for that. And we have a couple of questions in the comment box.
Please, yes.
I see one Karuna Shri, who is our faculty member. She has she has asked a question. Could you please suggest some books on China's ethnic minority communities?
Oh yes, certainly. I don't have them memorized, but I do have some titles. And if you'd like to write an email to me, I'd be happy to send you the names of those titles. And I do have a recent article that's been written on Chinese writers from Chinese ethnic minority groups who have written about plants. So I'd be happy to share that with you. Thanks for the question.
Okay, that's very nice. And I can share your email to Karnashri. Okay, the next question we have is from Kabir Pasha. India has a rich treasure of various ethnic literature. Is it because India has the cultural diversity and varied ethnic background?
I believe so, absolutely. The diversity of ethnic cultural groups often reflects the diversity of ethnic minority literature. And I think that's certainly the case for India, with an incredible diversity of ethnic minority groups. Each one of those groups has an oral tradition, a cosmology that's particular to that group. And as contemporary literature, ethnic minority literature is evolving, lots of those themes from the oral traditions are being reinterpreted by contemporary novelists and poets. So yes, I would agree with your comment that the diversity of ethnic minority groups in India is a reflection of the diversity of ethnic minority literature. And that certainly holds true for other places where literary expression has been given a certain amount of freedom, the United States, Canada, and parts of South America and elsewhere in the world as well. So thank you for the question and comment.
Thank you, sir. And the next question is from Uhutu Keho. I don't know if I am pronouncing it correctly. Do psychocritics treat their subjects, that is plants, as conscious beings capable of understanding and rationalizing?
That's a great question, and it's a current topic in phytocriticism. There's a book I'm reading at the moment called Novel Cultivations. It's a re-examination of 19th century Victorian era British novels from a phytocritical perspective. Now, the question of consciousness intelligence is highly contested, both within science but also culturally. Many literary critics would scoff at the idea of a plant having a conscious agency within a narrative. However, many phytocritics would argue for agency. Now, agency is an interesting issue because it doesn't necessarily require a definition of consciousness and intelligence. To say something has an agency within a cultural context or a literary context or a literary work means that it has a presence, as Buell commented in his definition of eco-criticism. Now that plant, what most phytocritics would say is that plant is a presence in that novel or poem, that it has a narrative function, that it even might be considered the term is vegetal narrator or vegetable narrator. So it's a great question. And I would say some phytocritics would look towards ideas of consciousness and intelligence, but many look towards the idea of agency. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And we have Satyanarayana. He has asked about how some texts like Things Fall Apart can be categorized as indigenous or ethnoliterature.
Yes, a great question, and it does pertain to this broader question of classifying literary text and how literary texts actually defy classification, and literary writers also resist classification. But I would say a text like Things Fall Apart and other texts, the distinction is the text written by a member of the ethnic minority group in that society? Secondly, if the text is written by a member of the ethnic majority group, is the text itself addressing issues about that are relevant to the members of ethnic minority groups in that society, right? So a work of ethnoliterature doesn't necessarily need to be written by a member of an ethnic or indigenous cultural group. It can also be written by the dominant a member of the dominant or majority group, but who is sensitively writing about issues of relevance to those ethnic minority, indigenous, or tribal groups. Great question. Thank you.
I think he has answered Satyanarayana. And now coming to Kabyar, it is like the question is, sir, why academicians speaking about NE are not touching Easterline Kair from Nagaland? She has contributed more than Dai or Ao to eco folk literature.
Yes, great point. There, I use Dai simply as an example, and personally, my interest in her work and the poem. But the point I want to make is that there is vast potential to apply environmental ethnoliterature approaches to the literature specifically of Northeast India. So I would look forward to you and other academics taking up the work that you've mentioned. Now, literary scholars often also follow those authors who have received awards recently, and that could be the case with the selection of some particular writers, writers who have received major awards and who have an international as well as local standing. So yes, thank you very much.
That's it for Kavya. We have one Suman Bala asking, do you think that ethnoliterature is somehow related with pagan culture?
It's an interesting question, and if we think of folk literature, there can be lots of pagan elements in there. It depends on how you want to define pagan. But let's think of pagan as autochthonous, right? This really interesting word, autochthonous, which means a culture that has a close relationship to the earth, traditionally. A culture whose traditions come from that close relationship to the earth. So I would say certainly ethnoliterature and folk literature do have a relationship to pagan ideas. if paganism is defined as an autochthonous culture, one with a deep connection to the land, to plants, to animals, and so on, non-human life. Thank you.
Sir, we'll take two more questions as the time is we are running out of time. I'll take the question of Mr. Edwin Moses. Sir, can you comment on the significance of indigenous knowledge in addressing ecological crisis, especially with reference to Australian aborigines and writers like Utkiru Nanenkal?
Yes, yeah, very good question. So Nunakal was very much an Aboriginal activist. She worked with Judith Wright, one of the most prominent Australian poets, during the 60s and 70s, in defense of the Great Barrier Reef, in defense of the ecology of Queensland. And later in life, Nunakal started an environmental education center on the island of her of her ancestors off of the Queensland, Brisbane coast. So Indigenous knowledge is very important, and especially Indigenous ecological knowledge is very important to understanding the response of Australian Aboriginal writers to the current environmental crisis. Australian Aboriginal writers will often talk about the ways in which environmental crisis is affecting cultural cohesion and community identity in Australia. Modern contemporary writers those writers who are writing now, novelists like Kim Scott, novelist that you should be aware of called Alexis Wright, Wright, writing phenomenal work that can be considered ethnoliterature, but also delves into dystopian literature and science fiction, and especially in the case of Wright. So environmental crisis is very much informing the literature by Indigenous Australian writers being written now. Thank you.
Now, we have one more question from Karunya Sundari. Sir, can you comment on the ecological imperialism with reference to American literature, especially writers like Linda Hogan and Barbara Kingson?
Yes, another good question. And I think, say, with Hogan and other Native American writers, their writing is often a kind of form of resistance to American imperialism and neo-imperialism, neo-colonization, the effects of colonization that have this ongoing cycle and chain. So colonialism and colonization and colonial critique, post-colonial critique, is a very, very important part of ethno-literature and also in environmental literature. Now, if we think of the effects of neo-colonialism on land, that has direct effects on indigenous communities and ethnic minority groups and tribal groups in the case of India and elsewhere. So that neo-colonial impact on the land will very much have an impact on the culture, which then feeds back into the kind of literary works that are being written by authors such as Hogan in America, but also authors in Australia, New Zealand, India, and elsewhere. So thank you very much for the question. And the last point I'll leave you with is thinking about the connection between ethnoliterature and environment helps to understand Indigenous literature in this particular age of environmental transformation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. John. I would request Dr. Manjula Bashni, the department lead, to give her concluding note, and I'll give the questions. I'll collect the questions and I'll send forward to you, and for the remaining questions will be answered by you through mail. Okay, so I am handing over the session to Dr. K. Manjula Bashni. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Radhika. Good evening, everyone. I am Manjula Bashini, Associate Professor in the Department of English, Guru College of Liberal Arts and Science. Ours was a 2018 initiative from the Shakti Group with nearly 9 UG courses and 1 PG, and this year we are launching 7 certificate diploma programs. I really feel elated to join you for this closing remark, and in a way it's quite paradoxical. The situation is quite paradoxical. The world is facing a threatful situation, At the same time, it has given us many opportunities like this. And at the outset, I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Vigila Kennedy, and our management for their continuous support and motivation. Motivation, particularly to explore the world and to bring back home the best. Something like the session that we are offering today. And my distinct appreciations to our expert for today, Dr. John, on his discourse on the traditions of Northeast Indian writing in English, and it traveled to indigenous literature, eco-criticism, ethnopoetics, zoo criticism, psycho-criticism, and so many things. Thank you so much, Professor. It was really a distinctive voice in this realm, and actually a powerful voice that articulates their senses and sentiments and focuses on some of the contemporary issues. Thank you, Dr. John, for your valuable insights on ethnoliterature. I, along with the faculty team, would like to thank Dr. Radhika for organizing this remarkable expert conversation. My sincere thanks to all those who joined us this evening for this wonderful session. A very special thanks to Professor Leo, Head Department of Visual Communication, for the strong technical support and success for the successful run of this program. And goodbye until we meet you next Friday on Expert Conversations. For any information regarding the future Expert Conversations, watch us out in our college website and our college Facebook and Instagram page. Once again, I thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.